Thanks again for being with us today. Welcome to Eckstein Hall, the Marquette University Law School. I'm Mike Goucher, and this is, as you know, On the Issues. This is our continuing series of conversations with news and policymakers, people we say are doing interesting and important work in this region and beyond. Today we are joined by Tom Nichols. He is Professor of National Security Affairs at the U.S. Naval War College. He also teaches at the Harvard Extension School, and he has been a former aide in the U.S. Senate. He's also written a number of books, and the one I have in my hands is creating quite a bit of buzz. It's called The Death of Expertise, The Campaign Against Established Knowledge and Why It Matters. Won't you please welcome Professor Tom Nichols to Marquette Law School.
Thank you very much.
It's great to have you here. Let's get a couple things on the record. First of all, these are your opinions. You're not speaking for anyone. You're not speaking for the Naval War College, none of that.
Not my own views, not those of the Naval War College, U.S. government, or any. I'm here on my own time to talk with you.
And the other thing we should say is that there might be some people in this room who will look at this book and The Death of Expertise and the Campaign Against Established Knowledge, and they will figure Tom Nichols wrote a book about 2016, about Donald Trump becoming president, and the truth is you've been thinking about this and writing about this for some time now.
Absolutely. The book actually had nothing to do with the election. I started the book, actually I wrote the book as a blog post in a fit of pique that I was angry about 3.5 years ago. And it sort of took off from there and became a book. I talk a little bit about the election at the very end, but the book really had nothing to do with 2016 or Donald Trump or Hillary Clinton or anybody else.
One of the things I like about this book is that it's direct. It's blunt at times. And the introduction, I was struck by a statement you made in the introduction. I'll see if I can quote it correctly, but I think you said something along the lines of, we are a country that is obsessed with the worship of its ignorance. That is a really strong statement. Why do you say that?
Well, as you can tell from the book, I tend to pull my punches just a little.
What do you really mean?
Somehow, not knowing things, I don't expect lay people or even experts to know everything about everything. But somewhere along the line, not knowing things became a badge of pride. Not knowing things, saying, I haven't read that book, or I didn't watch that show, or I didn't read that newspaper. My common sense, my gut, my knowledge is good enough. And there was a time when people would accept, there was a time in this country when people would accept that there are things that I know, there are things that I don't know. Somehow we lost that to the point where people, and the word I use in the book, just if we're going to continue on with blunt and annoying statements, the word I use in the book is narcissism. Americans have become remarkably thin-skinned people. That to tell someone, as I say in the book, Americans have lost the ability to distinguish between telling someone they're wrong and telling someone they're stupid. If you say to someone, look, you're wrong, they say, are you calling me stupid? No, I'm saying you're wrong. And this becomes a kind of continual outrage that then retreats into a pride of, I may be wrong, but I'm proud of it. In fact, one thing that I came across when writing the book is something that studies now, there are more and more studies being done on them, called the backfire effect. That when people are wrong and you tell them they're wrong, they actually double down on being wrong. You say, look, I can show you that what you believed is wrong. They say, well, I don't care. Now I believe it even more strongly because you told me I'm wrong. And that's a really disturbing thing. We can't function this way as a country going on like this.
An example, I guess, of this might be the fact that some of the feedback you've gotten to writing this book, people say, well, sure, you're an elitist.
Yes.
You are a typical elitist. You're an academic. You're a professor. You think you know a lot about Russian affairs, for instance. So what?
The two comments that one comment that I get that I laugh about, I get two kinds of comments. One that I laugh about, one that I think hits me a little more deeply. The one that I laugh about, I get a lot of letters ever since I wrote the original magazine piece, and now the book is out. They say, look, I didn't read any of this, but I know you're wrong. I have letters, and I post them on Twitter. You can follow me on Twitter, by the way. I'm at Radio Free Tom, and I post some of these snippets of letters now and then where somebody will send me a letter and say, I didn't read your book, but here's why I know it's wrong.
Are these real tweets on your book?
No, actually, this was the...
they should be.
These are, they're actually close to real tweets. The art department at Oxford University Press, whom I owe a great debt to, Oxford has been wonderful in helping me get this book out. These are fake tweets, but they're really close to reality. They might as well be real tweets. And all the time, I haven't read your book, and I haven't read anything you've written, but here's why you're completely off base. The ones that get a little closer to home are the ones that say, well, you're just an out-of-touch elitist. Because I grew up in Western Massachusetts. I grew up in a factory town. I grew up next to smokestacks and paper mills that are now closed. I grew up next to factories that haven't had anybody in them since I was a young boy. My parents did not. My mom dropped out of high school after 9th grade. My dad dropped out after 10th. I'm about as far from an elitist as you can get. I just happened to be a guy who worked his way through college and went to graduate school and wrote a book. And so this is not some howl of elitism from, the coastal shores of upscale Connecticut or Southern California. This is actually something that concerns me more because my parents, although not educated people, were very informed people. My father and my mother read a newspaper every day. They watched the news every evening. My mom ran for city council and spent 2 years, on a zoning committee doing kind of the daily business of government. This is not about elitists versus ordinary folks. This is about whether or not we're going to actually take the time to become informed.
Has it, to some degree, always been so that we're a little skeptical, a little cynical about the experts, or is it particularly bad now?
It's particularly bad now, but you're right that, my
Just tuck it in your pocket there.
tracking device seems to have, it's annoying. Nobody will know. By the way, my Uber driver did get lost, but I did see some cool stuff in Milwaukee, so it seems to be a beautiful city.
That's good.
There we go. I relate a story in the book. It's kind of always been thus. My brother is a retired cop, and he ran a bar, and I hesitate to even call it a bar. It's more like what you'd call a joint down by the railroad tracks. And so when I was a young professor, and I tell this story in the book, I was a young professor, but I was at a college near where I grew up, and I would drive down, and I'd go see my brother and kind of hang out and have a beer and see what he was doing, and I'd leave. One night, my brother told me, I walked out, and a guy in the bar watched me leave, and he turned to my brother and he said, "He's a professor, huh?" My brother said, "Yeah." And the guy, as God is my witness, the guy said, "Well, seems like a good guy anyway." And, if you're a professor, you just get used to that. It's always been the case that, people have a kind of love-hate relationship with scientists and teachers and professors and engineers, or you kind of need their expertise, but we sort of resent them being smarty pantses. It's different now. It is definitely different now. Now it is an actively hostile relationship between people who know stuff and kind of the public at large, and that's really dangerous.
And that makes it difficult even in our world to, and you write about this, to have a conversation. You have a chapter in your book called How Conversation Became Exhausting. What do you mean by that? Why is conversation exhausting today?
Because people can't agree even on first principles about what would constitute evidence, and everything is done in bad faith. We don't really have conversations with each other to try to learn more about what the other person thinks. We're not willing to accept new information when the other person gives it to us. We have conversations with each other now to win. We're just there to get into the trenches, establish what we believe, and to outdo the other guy. And usually in the service of some political view that we have that may or may not be reasonable. And it becomes exhausting because in that argument, people will deploy, people with each other, not just between experts and lay people, but among themselves. They will deploy every possible weapon they can find: confirmation bias, cherry picking. And you say, if you said, for example, Russia, I say in the book, Russians tend to be more corrupt than Norwegians. Now, what does that mean? Well, it means that the Russian bureaucracy tends to be a little less regular. There are ways to talk about that. The problem is, if you start having that discussion, and immediately somebody says, "Really? I knew a Norwegian guy who took a bribe." Okay, but that doesn't mean it. Or, Americans are taller. Another example I use in the book. Americans are taller than Chinese people. Yao Ming is 7 feet tall. Okay, but that doesn't mean anything. And that's how people argue now. It's like, look, I can get one up on you. I can beat your argument. I can come up with some bizarre example and outflank you. And that's not really a conversation. That's just verbal boxing.
Part of this, too, is also and I think I've seen this as I've gotten older, the prevalence of conspiracy theories. Oh. That has become a big part of what passes for discourse these days.
Absolutely. Conspiracy theories have always been around. But mostly in the past, they were passed by word of mouth. Jerry Mathers died in Vietnam. I'll throw a few of them out there, right? I bet you've heard these, right? That the beaver, Leave the Beaver, died in Vietnam, right? Didn't. Is there a library here at Marquette? Because every university has a library where this story is, that the building had problems because they didn't count on the weight of the books. Right? You're nodding. Every stupid college sophomore believes that, and it's become like a thing to just say, oh, the probably weight of the books, the architects are stupid. There are alligators in the sewers of New York, and on and on.
That's not true?
Yeah. Cannibalistic humanoid dwellers in the... Now, why does this happen? Well, first of all, because it's fun. Conspiracy theories are fun, right? I mean, life is boring. Ordinary life is boring. Take the Malaysian jetliner. Let's take a real example. A couple of years ago, the Malaysian jetliner. More conspiracy. It's in Kazakhstan. Terrorists have it. The bodies are in cryostorage. They were, aliens beamed on. The Enterprise put it in a tractor beam. Who knows? The simpler explanation is that the pilot had emotional problems, probably ditched the plane out at sea as a way of committing suicide. Nobody wants to come to that conclusion because that's terrifying. That's worse than any conspiracy because it could happen to you. You could get on that plane and you get on the next flight you get on and you look in the cockpit and you say, is that guy going through a divorce? See? Taking his medication. As opposed to saying, oh, this probably isn't the one flight that is going to be hijacked to Kazakhstan by Al-Qaeda to create a false flag to knock down. It's just more interesting. The other reason people can go to these things is because as the world gets more complex, people want more solutions. And so when you feel defeated by how complicated and busy the world is, you try to fill in those blanks. Because otherwise you have to believe that all the bad things that happen in the world are the result of some either pure chance, which is terrifying, or an uncaring God, which is also terrifying. Buffalo Bills fans, you remember I talk about it in the book, there was an episode of The X-Files where the cigarette smoking man, the guy behind the big conspiracy said, and by the way, as they're creating everything that goes on with the aliens, says, by the way, the Bills never win the Super Bowl. That never happens while I'm alive. It's easier than believing that the Bills stink, right? So somewhere...
It could lose 4 in a row,
right,
yeah.
Somewhere somebody's doing this, and it's more comforting.
Let's point some fingers at things that are that institutions or things that are responsible for this campaign against established knowledge. And you don't let a number of them off the hook. We're sitting on a college campus. You have some criticism for higher education and its role in the death of expertise. And I have to tell you, when I saw there was going to be a whole chapter on that, my immediate reaction was, well, that seems counterintuitive because, students who go to college are exposed to experts like you. They learn things. They have an appreciation for knowledge. How could that possibly be the case? So enlighten me. Why is that the case?
Well, ironically, part of the problem is that everybody goes to college. There was once a time in America where going to college was actually a marker of intellectual achievement. It was not just the natural next progression after high school. Because remember, within the lifetime, I think, maybe of people in this room, graduating from high school was actually not the most common experience. Most people in America had some high school, many graduated from high school, some very fewer number went to college, and an even fewer number went into the professions. Most people went into the trades. The problem is that after the baby boom, college has expanded to be a mass experience. And that, I actually, if you want to see how mad I can really make people, I talk about the difference between people who go to college or they go to college. Because what they're really doing is they're going to a post-secondary school experience where they're kind of killing some time before they go to do whatever they would have done straight out of high school. There's a quote in the book from a guy, I didn't name the school, but he went to a well-known party school out in the West Coast, and he said, college, or as we called it, those magical 7 years between high school and your first warehouse job. Now, the problem with that is that buoyed by an inexhaustible source of loans. Now, I'm not talking about law school, because this is a unique environment that we're in. Law school is a different matter. Small number of people go. They compete very aggressively to get in. Most colleges in America don't even have what we would consider competitive admissions anymore. Basically, if you can get out of high school, you can go to a college somewhere, which is, in many cases, just a remedial program to pick up a lot of things that were missed in high school. So this causes problems in two ways. First of all, we no longer make a distinction between people who know stuff and don't know stuff based on college. College is no longer a solid marker of intellectual attainment. Because if you say, well, I know something because I went to college, everybody in the room says, well, so did I. Now, that doesn't mean that, the problem is we say, well, one of those guys might have gone to Georgia Tech and gotten a degree in physics, and the other guy might have gone to a small local college and majored in hanging around. But we call it all college. The other problem is that in order to capture that market and to pull in all of that income, colleges now market themselves as an experience where the students are the clients. And the customer always has to be right. That as a professor at an elite school said to me many years ago, long before I even started writing this, he said, sometimes I don't feel like a professor. I feel like a clerk in an expensive boutique. Because the students come in and tell us what they're going to do. I still remember the first time I started teaching, a student handed me I was an advisor. Technically, it was my call, and he slid his card across. He said, sign that, please. I said, no, I'm not signing it. I'm going to look at what you're taking, and I'm going to tell you whether I approve of it. And there was almost this look like, when did the help get so uppity? What do you mean you're going to tell me what to? I said, well, if you want me to sign the card, I get a say. And that increasingly has gone by the boards because we treat students as, come to our college. We have great pizza. We have terrific dorms. We have a lot of extracurriculars. We have a study abroad program. And we're marketing college to 16-year-olds like we're buying a car. Except a car loan will last longer. I told my godson, who is now graduate from college and doing fine, but when he came to me for advice, he said, well, and I don't know if I could live there, and I don't know if I could do that. And I said, you're going to be in college for less time than your dad has a car lease. And he sort of, was stunned by that. And I think, unfortunately, kids don't apply to college. College is marketed to them.
You're also concerned about what you see on campuses that sort of want to be safe places, that some students do not necessarily want to be exposed to certain points of view, which they may find objectionable or they may strongly disagree with. That concerns you.
College is not a safe space. College is where you go to have everything challenged. It's supposed to, I say right at the beginning of the chapter about colleges, college is supposed to be uncomfortable. It's not supposed to validate you and tell you how awesome you are, and it's not supposed to replicate being 14 in high school. It's supposed to be where you're thrown in with people who are different, who challenge your beliefs, who are going to offend you. Basically, it's meant to help you to take your place as part of the educated part of a citizenry. And when students, and I talk about the events that happened at Yale and Missouri and other schools, when the students say, here's what we want. First of all, they get into the habit of lecturing the faculty. As a faculty member, I don't much care for that. I'm paid to do the talking. I'm sitting on this side of the desk. Let's assume that I'm probably know where all this is going and I'm probably right. But the students on top of that say, I want this to be like a home. One of the kids who unloaded last fall on a Yale professor said, you are supposed to create a place of comfort and home here. To which I said, no. And he said, I disagree with that. He said very calmly, I disagree with that. And she then unloaded a string of F-bombs on him. That is not what college is about. College is where you learn a certain amount of humility and flexibility, and you learn how much you don't know about things. It's not there to affirm what a great kid you are, unfortunately.
And how does that translate into the death of expertise?
those kids will leave college. They're supposed to be the educated vanguard of our society. They're supposed to be the people who are a little bit ahead as the knowers in a society. And it turns out that they come out with some of the most fragile egos, some of the greatest resistance to learning, the illusion of knowing more than they know, which is a problem that is throughout our society and for most people is generated by the internet. It takes what should be educated people and it makes them into very thin-skinned, highly resistant people to further education.
Let's talk for a moment about the role of the internet, and a lot of people blame the internet for what we see today. Your chapter, I think, was titled, let me Google that for you, how unlimited information is making us dumber. How is it possible that having access to more information than we ever could imagine, how can that possibly make us dumber?
The metaphor I use in the book is that thinking that you're smarter because you've been spending a lot of time on the internet is like walking through a rainstorm and thinking you're a good swimmer because you got wet. You're not learning anything. You're passively letting pages and pages of information blow by you while you pick out things here and there that you think are making you smarter. And Mike and I were talking about this beforehand. You know, part of the problem is we now have empirical evidence. We now have data where people have been tested before and after, right? Where they've been asked to look something up and then they spend time on the internet and then the researchers talk to them afterwards. And we actually we know that people will believe they are smarter than they are coming out of it because they have simply been clicking through enough pages and they lose the ability to know what they saw on the internet and what they think they already knew. In the book, for example, I use the example of fossil fuel. Let's say you're told, I want you to look up something on fossil fuels. Well, you put in fossil and fuels. You start getting a lot of pictures about dinosaurs and fossils and coal and Africa. And then finally, you leave that and someone says, hey, do you know anything about dinosaurs? Oh yeah, I knew that stuff. Because you saw it and now you think you know it. And you're actually dumber because the stuff you know may not even be true. You saw a lot of stuff, it passed through your brain, and like I said, it's like you got wet and now you think, wow, I swam the English Channel. You didn't. And that's a problem. The other problem with the way people use the internet is they go looking for the stuff they already believe, and that's a real problem.
You said the internet is changing, I love this line, changing the way we read, the way we reason, and the way we think, and all for the worse.
Yes, it is it's changing the way we read because we don't read, we scan. Another study that I talk about in the book is that people were asked to read things on the internet, and what we found is that they read the headlines, and then they move on. And as any writer can tell you, you're a journalist, we don't pick the headlines. Every piece I've ever written has a headline written by somebody else. So if you think you know what I wrote by reading headlines, you've never read anything I've written. It also changes the way we reason by mimicking debates, because there's two sides to everything on the internet. Even when there aren't two sides. Gravity, is it a good idea? Here's a web page that says no. And it changes the way we think because it rewires our brains. It rewires the way we take in information to say, if it doesn't come up in a matter of seconds, I'm not interested in it. It can't be important. We're finding, for example, that people really do prioritize whatever comes up first in a Google search. And I found with students, we were talking about students earlier. This is in ordinary people and in college students and graduate students. It has dramatically closed the window for how much patience they have to read anything. The idea that someone will sit down and read a book and start and say, I will not judge the argument in this book until I'm done, right? Guy wrote 250 pages, I guess that's the argument. That is now alien to most people. If you can't make that point in the first page, that's it. I'm back to clicking and moving on.
We were coming down the elevator, and I told Tom that one of the lines I loved in the book was, this is a dated cultural reference for our younger audience members today, but there was a TV show called Cheers back in the old days, and there was a character who sat at the bar named Cliff Clavin. He says in his book, technology has made us all Cliff Clavins.
Yeah, well, You see, Mike, studies have shown that, and you know, we're all that guy now. I mean, we loved Cliff. I mean, Cliff was one of the most beloved. In fact, here's a bit of trivia, since I am also a 5-time Jeopardy champion.
Yeah, I didn't say that in the introduction. 5 times.
See, that's why we don't say it, because all the other achievements, people not playing, they say, I was on Jeopardy, and then they go, oh, now.
Russian affairs.
Which is proof that it's not real unless it's on TV. But Cliff was not supposed to be a regular character. He was an add-on, and people fell in love with him. Why? Because we all know a guy like that, right? We all have that uncle at the table who sits back and says, well, I have a few thoughts about Soviet arms control. You know, and you say, okay, all right, bring it on. The problem is now we've all turned into that guy. Because again, going back to the comment about why is conversation exhausting? Because we're all trying to be the smartest kid in the room. We're all trying to one-up each other. We're all trying to outdo each other. And we all have this little pocket confirmation bias machine in our pockets that will give us the answers we want at any given time. And, Cliff Clavin is a great character. No one wants to live in a world full of Cliffs. And that's where we are now.
Talk about the media with us. The media's changed a lot in the last, since I got into it. I mean, when I got into it, there were basically ABC, NBC, CBS, and PBS. Now you've got 24-hour cable stations. Let's start there. What about the effect of 24-hour news? How has that played into this?
Once again, it's information overload. And part of the problem rests with the viewer, but a big part of it rests with the cable outlets themselves. When you have a 24-hour news cycle, you have to fill that time. And it means you have to keep talking even if you're out of things to say. And it means that if you're out of things to say, you're going to bring in experts. Now, I did these scare quotes around college. You have to bring in experts who may or may not know what they're talking about. Now, I will admit, in my youth, I made some of those mistakes. People say, hey, you want to be on TV? And I went, what did Andy Warhol say, right? Yeah. Never miss the chance to have sex or be on television. So I said, a chance to be on television? And sure, when I was a young guy, I went on TV and I said some dumb things on occasion. No doubt about it. I mean, I'm a more seasoned expert. I've actually told producers now, I can't, producers have said, do you want to talk about this issue? And I'm now experienced enough to be able to say, I don't know enough to talk about that. And I can't come on, and I can't lie to you. But they have to fill that time. And so we have these huge tag team matches of 7 or 8 people crammed into 15 minutes, and then they just keep going. I always love, too, that they say, panel, stay with us, as though they're going to go somewhere, right? So I say, well, I got to leave, Wolf. I got to go. They're not going anywhere. They have to fill that time. And that means that it's just, as I call it, the news is no longer the news. It's video wallpaper. It's just left on in the background as the background noise of your life. My folks, yours, some of the folks in this audience, that half-hour news, whether it was Walter Cronkite or Dan Rather or whoever, you paid attention for a half hour and you assumed that what you were being told was important. Now, in fairness, some of the younger folks in this audience will say, yeah, that was a great time when a bunch of old white guys in New York decided what everybody was going to learn. But I don't know that we're that much better off when an arms control treaty and Kim Kardashian's derriere are competing for the same priority in the public space. I mean, I think the world does need gatekeepers, another word that people respond negatively to. And I think journalism has lost a lot of its gatekeepers in the competition for eyeballs. Journalists used to tell you what they thought you needed to know. Now they ask you what you want to hear. And that's dangerous.
Within the realm of media, there was the development of talk radio. And obviously a lot of conservatives, and you are a conservative, a lot of conservatives felt that talk radio helped make up for what they felt was a liberal bias in the media.
Absolutely.
Are there consequences to the popularity of talk radio?
Yes. I actually, in the 80s and the 90s, I thought that the emergence of talk radio was a perfectly understandable reaction to what was, in fact, an ideologically monolithic media. You weren't going to get a whole lot of, I mean, you didn't say, oh, that ABC was putting a lot of spin. I'll go over to CBS and get a different view. The news was homogenized. It had a particular kind of establishment viewpoint. And I thought the early talkers, even Limbaugh, who kind of mastered this form in the late 1980s, had some room. You know, there's a reason that liberal talk media never took off, because it wasn't an alternative to anything. Conservative talk radio was presenting itself as an alternative in a world where there were fewer of them. The problem is, once you've acquired that audience and established the notion that everyone lies to you but me, you have to keep giving the viewer bigger and bigger jolts of electricity. You have to give them bigger and bigger shocks to keep them listening to you, because the idea that you could ever go on there and say, well, you know, today we're going to talk about some interesting legislation isn't interesting. And I think that it became a Frankenstein that got out of control. I thought Fox was a necessary antidote to the homogeneity of networks and cable. And now Fox has become, you know, the outlet that has to feed its own audience. And the same happened with, especially for a while, with MSNBC, with CNN. The audience has become so segmented that everybody has turned into talk radio. But I never thought and I still think talk radio is not a bad format for people to talk back and to express their views. The problem is that it's become an echo chamber, where people only talk to people they agree with. They go to it to hear stuff. I went, and I'll wrap up this part with a piece from an experience I had shortly after the election. I went home to Massachusetts, to my factory town, where some of my friends are, and I said, you know, why did you vote the way you voted? And my friend said, because violent crime is out of control. I looked around, I said, it's not. He said, and unemployment, we're totally swamped with unemployment. I said, dude, we're in Massachusetts, it's 4.5%, maybe 5%. Let's say they're lying and it's 6%. That's still pretty good. He said, no, all that's right. He said to me, you're wrong. And I said, where are you getting this? And he said, Hannity. He's telling me the truth. And I said, well, I'm your best friend of 40 years, and you can either pick between me or Hannity, but we can't both be telling the truth.
Do experts deserve any of the blame for the death of expertise?
None.
I don't think that's going to be your answer, actually.
I actually have I have a whole chapter in the book called When Experts Are Wrong. And experts get things wrong all the time. I think the two biggest mistakes experts make is becoming overly defensive about when they're wrong and trying to sweep it under the carpet. Because, again, you know, in a way, experts are like airline pilots, right? We land the plane safely 100,000 times, one plane crash, and we're all idiots. And so the public's confirmation bias really comes down on us hard. But that also means that experts get very defensive, that, well, we didn't really make a mistake, and we're going to explain to you why it wasn't really a mistake. And then they do the thing that's even worse. They withdraw from the public sphere, and they only talk to each other. And they talk to each other in a very arcane, jargon-laden language. And you said to me earlier, you found the book not written that way, so thank you, because I didn't write it that way. I did not write this book for other academics. I wrote it for you. And I think that's a real problem. And my argument is, if you're going to be an expert and you're going to argue that you have expert knowledge, then get out there and take your lumps. But also to talk back. That experts have become very timid about talking back to the public. And I think we need to re-engage, which is, you know, why I'm here in Milwaukee today. But we make our mistakes, and you know, we have done dumb things. There's a whole section in there about fraud and plagiarism and manipulating results and all those things that I have never done, but that, you know, other scholars have definitely engaged in and should pay the price for.
I told Tom earlier, I actually found the last chapter of the book somewhat depressing, and I'll have you address that. I mean, you come to this conclusion that, again, using your words, that there was a toxic confluence of arrogance and skepticism, cynicism, narcissism. This has all come together at this time, and it sort of left me wondering, how does this play out? Where does this end? Where do you think it ends?
I really want to believe that somehow we can snap ourselves out of this, but I don't think that's going to happen. You know, I keep trying. I guess that last chapter was more pessimistic than I thought, because every interview I've ever done, people say, so that last chapter, man, you're bumming me out, man. My concern is that the only thing that will snap us out of this is what has snapped us out of it in the past, which is a disaster. A war, a depression, and I mean a real conflict. I mean, I work with the military all day. The conflicts that we're fighting, people are getting killed, but they're not touching the American public. If you don't know anybody in the military, a lot of what happens in the world is invisible to you. I'm talking about a war that really, creates a sense of threat to Americans themselves. A depression, not like the 2008 recession, but the kind of depression, even within my lifetime. I mean, when students say, well, it can't get any worse. Of course, I love the short horizon of students. This is the worst ever. And I say, I've lived through 1974, 1975, 76. It could be worse. Or a pandemic. This argument about vaccines and doctors and big pharma, and everybody has the luxury to argue that until their fever hits about 102. And all of a sudden, then suddenly people say, oh, maybe maybe all those years of medical school probably could help me out here. I'd like to think we can get back to a healthier relationship with the experts in society before then, but I'm not that optimistic.
Why didn't 9/11 change us? Because I remember when I was working full-time in the media, the theory was that we were going to go back to, we had sort of lost our way. We were going to go back to covering serious news. We do more in-depth. Why do these people hate us? All that kind of stuff. But we would provide insight to that. And I think, 15, 16 years later, we look at where we are. And you're right, the Kardashians dominate a lot of headlines. It's, what happened at the Oscars the other night is a far bigger story than, what's happening right now in many places around this world.
People are demanding more accountability from the Oscars than they are from their government. I thought, it's interesting you bring up 9/11, Mike, because I thought that would do it too. I thought, okay, we've become a kind of unserious country. A lot of affluence, a lot of pop culture that we kind of marinate ourselves in, and 9/11 was a wake-up call. I think there were several problems. First of all, I would argue that the Bush administration tried to handle 9/11 without affecting the lives of ordinary people. I think if we were going to go to war, then you can't do that while telling the American public to go shopping and tax decrease. At some point, war means an aggregation of responsibility and that, sacrifices. And we tried to do it on the cheap and to say, don't worry, our volunteer military will go fix this because they're Jedi Knights and they can handle this. The other problem is we monetized 9/11, and I'll tell you what I mean by that. We pumped a huge amount of money into it and said, hey, we need experts on terrorism. And a lot of people who are very entrepreneurial stepped forward and said, I'm an expert on terrorism. I'll take that money, when in fact they weren't at all. And you saw in the years after 9/11, terrorism programs and sprung up at graduate schools like mushrooms, trying to get a hold of that money. And the people who really had invested the time, who spoke Arabic, for example. This is a bugaboo with me because I'm a Russia specialist, and part of that was I spent years learning Russian, and I'm still not as good at it as I wish I could have been. People who don't speak Arabic, who've never spent any significant amount of time in a Muslim-majority country, who have a long track record of publication on these issues. They were outnumbered immediately by people saying, yeah, you want to pay me to work in one of those glass boxes just outside of Washington that you're building? Sure, I'm in, and I'll do that. And once again, we kind of dropped that ball. So I think there's a lot of blame to go around there.
I'm going to run just a couple minutes along with this part of it. We will take a couple questions here at the end. But I wanted to talk to you about a couple of other matters. Some people may know you because of the stance you took during the presidential campaign. And you were a never Trump guy. But you also describe yourself as a Republican, as a conservative. You had concerns about, well, I'll let you address what the concerns were, but I guess what my question would be is, a month in, have any of your concerns been allayed?
Well, this is a good time to point out again that I don't represent the U.S. government or any view but my own. I was not happy with any of the choices in the election, here's the least popular thing I can say. I put some blame on the Republicans, I put some blame on the Democrats, but the people I blame more than any other are the voters who wanted what they wanted, didn't want to learn, didn't want to embrace the complexity of the issues, wanted simple answers, have gotten used to presidential elections as popularity contests between rock stars, and that includes the 2 elections with President Obama and just presented us with some bad choices. One of my biggest concerns related to the death of expertise is, I was very uncomfortable voting for somebody who said, hey, the experts are terrible. I don't need experts. Who needs advice?
I said that here in Wisconsin, I think.
So I have a very good brain. Mm-hmm. Well, that's the kind of person I wrote the book for, because nobody is that smart. And I worked in Washington. I worked in the Senate. Running your government is a really hard thing to do. It's not only complicated, but let me let you in on a little secret about running the United States government. It's boring. It is the most boring thing. Some of the days, I always said that working in national politics is the way my dad used to describe police work. Hours of boredom punctuated by moments of sheer terror. Most of the days, it is the most boring stuff. If you can make your way through the American budget, God bless you, because it is the dullest stuff you're ever going to read, and it requires a huge amount of attention, and knowledge. And I just wasn't comfortable with this. Now, with that said, have some things allayed my fears? Secretary of Defense Mattis, National Security Advisor McMaster, which made me feel a lot better. There are Gorsuch, which I think was a good pick, but I still think at the heart of it, this is governing by Twitter, governing by TV. And I've had a theory all along that the president, my own view, the president never expected to win the election. That he just wanted to be kind of the shadow president and go around and have rallies and have all the fun. But that I think he's finding now, and I hope it changes him, but I think, it's hard to change people after a certain point, that governing is a very complicated, exhausting, boring bit of drudgery that has to just get plowed through every day. And I'm still concerned about that.
He speaks to Congress tonight, to the nation. What could he say tonight that would make you think he gets it? That's a hard question.
Yeah. I've finally decided to start listening to people that were not on the campaign who know stuff and are going to help me fix things. That would make me feel better.
I should say, though, you wrote a really fascinating piece in the Washington Post maybe a month ago, and sort of the crux of that was that there's a lot of outrage about what Donald Trump is doing right now, and in your mind, not all outrage is equal. That we're panicking over some things that actually other presidents have done.
And this goes directly back to this lack of civic knowledge and civic education. Most people in this country simply don't know how their own government works. And you can tell that it makes me testy because I'm talking like this now. That's kind of my daddy big teacher voice. But most people just don't take the time to learn how their government works. And I wrote a piece in the Washington Post saying, stop freaking out every time Donald Trump does the normal things that a new president does. You may remember there was a story that said, Trump fired all the ambassadors. He fired the ambassadors. Okay, breaking news. Oh, that's the other thing. Breaking news, right? When we were kids, if it said breaking news, your heart jumped into your throat, right? It meant a president had been shot or something. Now it's breaking news, it's Wednesday. All day. So, breaking news. When a new president comes in, the politically appointed ambassadors are expected to resign because they are the president's personal representative. The new president is supposed to pick the new ambassadors. That's his job. And it was reported on the media as though Trump had personally called every one of them and said, you're fired, and that the embassies had no one in them, and that, foreign leaders were knocking on the door and couldn't get any answer. This is nonsense. This is what happens in every presidential transition. And we have to stop freaking out about everything, because then when there is a crisis, when there is something that you're really going to object to that the president does, you're not going to know it, because you've been in such a state of high outrage every day that when everything is outrageous, nothing is. It just becomes part of the noise of your life.
I have to, before we take audience questions, I have to ask you about your Twitter account. And he mentioned it earlier, at Radio Free Tom. It's interesting. You've got about 60,000 followers, last time I checked. I happen to be one of them. And you mix it up with people. I mean, people give it to you and you give it back. And I'm wondering why you are as involved in Twitter as you are, because I would guess that Twitter in some ways adds to the death of expertise.
It does.
That it contributes to it.
It does. I didn't start on Twitter to go in there and mix it up with folks. I went there to sort of, as I think being a teacher, that I said earlier, experts need to engage. Well, the fact of the matter is, if you're going to engage, you have to be on social media. And I make myself available to people. I have always loved taking questions. When I had fewer followers, I could take more of them. But I've always loved taking questions from people and kind of, answering them or telling them, what they want to know. But over the years, part of what led to the book itself was people saying, we're both on Twitter, so we're peers. We're equals. I'm a random guy in, New Mexico, and I know you've spent 30 years doing this, but since we're both on Twitter, I'm going to argue with you. And that's when I say, that's when I kind of crack my knuckles and pull the keyboard close and say, now you're going to understand why you don't do this, because you are not an expert. And I think if you follow my Twitter feed, you see I react differently to experts. When experts come into my feed and say, Tom, you're wrong, I back up and say, okay, fellow expert, tell me why I'm wrong. And then I will have arguments with them. I'm there hopefully to enlighten people, but I also don't shy away from a fight, from a debate. I shouldn't call it a fight, from a debate. And I think that this is part of the problem, is that social media, because you are anonymous behind the keyboard, you think that, you say things to each other and to experts and to other public figures that you would never say. Because most people are decent people. They don't want to talk that way. Most of us want to be liked by other human beings. We don't want to have those kind of confrontations. And so it gets my Irish up, and I decide that I'm just going to see it through and simply not disengage, because that is partly what some of these folks do. The other reason I tough it out sometimes is because some of the people I'm talking to are Russians who are invading social media and planting fake news stories and trying to move the public debate. And, I'm a Russia guy from way back, so I'm more than happy to mix it up with that.
What do you think about what's happening with our relationship and Russia's, or allegations of a relationship with Russia? What do you think about all that?
Well, first thing I'll say is we have to stop weaponizing the term fake news. Fake news there is such a thing as fake news. It's when someone sits down to create a lie out of whole cloth and then pollute the public sphere with it to paralyze the public's ability to think clearly. Fake news is not news that you don't happen to like. Go to my doctor. Tom, put on a few pounds. Fake news, doc. With the Russians, there is no doubt in my mind. Now, let me just say at the outset, I do not believe the Russians changed the outcome of the American election. I think Hillary Clinton lost fair and square. The Electoral College everybody knew the rules of the Electoral College going in. You have to give credit to the Trump organization for figuring out how to wind that path through the Rust Belt to figure out how to do that. With that said, there is also no doubt in my mind that the Russian government openly attacked the institutions of American democracy and need to pay a price for it. And I don't think we should stop investigating it. There have been calls for a special prosecutor to look into the president's relationship with Russia. I think that's short-sighted. I think we need to have a bipartisan commission that looks into what are the Russians doing to the United States and the Western democracies, because I'm an old Cold Warrior. I started my career, I was 31 when the Berlin Wall fell, so I'd already been working in this stuff for almost a decade with the old Soviet Union. This is the most brazen attack on the American political system I've ever seen come out of Russia. And I think we have to do something about it. And I don't think we should, but once again, the partisanship that is poisoning all of our souls makes us wave it away. Because if you talk to the Hillary people, once you say they didn't rig the election, they stop hearing you. And if you talk to the Trump people, they say, I don't want to talk about Russia at all because it's uncomfortable and it could go places I don't want it to go. Well, somewhere in the middle, there has to be some discussion about the fact that our chief enemy in the world is directly attacking our democratic institutions, and they can't get away with it.
I'm going to take 2 or 3 questions from the audience. If you're in the seating bowl, press down on the rim, not on the ball, on the rim. Keep your finger down on it. We'll be able to hear your questions. And if you're in the back, raise your hand, and we'll try and have Ryan, who has a microphone, get over to you so we can hear that question. Yes, sir.
I'm inclined to think there are 2 causes of the lack of respect for expertise these days that preceded the internet and Limbaugh and a lot of things you've talked about, and they occurred in the 1970s. Watergate, which caused most of us who were functional then to lose a lot of faith in the truthfulness of our government. And around at the same time, the rise of the evangelical churches, the white Baptist churches, pushing and telling us that the world was really created in 6 days and disregard Darwin and all evolutionary things. I'm just thinking those two had a lot to do with the way we are today. And I just wonder what your thoughts are.
Well, let me take the second part first and say I am not an evangelical. I don't know how many of my co-religious here. I'm actually Greek Orthodox. So I don't come from an evangelical tradition. I have no beef with the evangelical community. Where I do have a problem is when politicians started pandering to that. That's where it became a problem. When somebody said, "Do you believe in evolution?" and politicians start going, "Well, there's a lot of debate." No, there isn't. That I think that emergence as a political force has had that baleful influence. But I don't blame as much as this general collapse of trust in government. But one thing I do say in the book. Please be careful to separate government from experts. I advised the politician. I sat with him on the floor of the Senate when he voted for the first Gulf War. But I have to tell you, he took my advice and worked with my input, but I didn't cast that vote. The knowers and the deciders are almost never the same people. And I tell a story in the book that he's since passed away. He died many years ago in a plane crash, but the senator took my advice very often and treated me as a trusted advisor. I can also tell you that he threw me out of his office in a firestorm of F-bombs because we had a disagreement about how the war was going to shape up. I mean, we had really deep conflict. And it was okay for me to sit there and say, "Well, boss, you're wrong." I'm not the guy that had to go cast the vote. So please don't let the concern about the faith in government bleed over into the faith in experts, because I have a whole section of the book about why our advice is not always taken, why it's sometimes taken incompletely, why the government sometimes only listens to the part of it they want to hear. But the only people that can make the government accountable, not me.
Who's in the back there? I want to make sure I'm getting somebody in the back. Ryan, you want to go over here, grab?
Hi.
Hi.
Fascinating. And this is a question on one of your less interesting chapters. I phrased that badly. That's not what I meant at all.
We know it was meant as a compliment.
Please don't say it's all of them.
No, I wanted to ask you about the safe schools concept that you referred to, and the movement on college campuses to create safe campuses, because I agree with you that it seems like loading classrooms with pillows and psychologists. And I had several discussions with student leaders on this, and I think it turns out that it's a very reasonable movement, and I wonder if, you're a professor, so you must know more about it than I do. You're an expert, but I was concerned that your discussion today touched on anecdotal evidence and that you expressed that you don't like being challenged by students. So I worried that you sounded a little bit like an elite.
I love being challenged by students, but the fact of the matter is classroom is not a democracy. And I think the term you were looking for is, or at least, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but this has been raised with me before about student safe spaces, is that somehow I'm showing a lack of empathy. Fact of the matter is, I think that encouraging that whole notion of safe spaces and pillows and triggering and all of that stuff actually makes students less resilient. It makes their skins thinner. It makes them obsessed with their own grievances at a time. The world, once they graduate, the world doesn't care. Okay, I mean, colleges, one of the reasons I became a professor is I love colleges. I love campuses. They're to me, they're one of the most wonderful places in the world, but they're not the real world. And if we're not preparing those students to go out there and accept how difficult the real world is, then we're not doing our job. And I actually include a piece from an essay. When I went to graduate school, I am a product of, at least in graduate school, of a Catholic education. And I had, he's since retired, very imposing Jesuit, steel gray buzz cut glasses named Jim Shaw. And Shaw, I walked into grad school, I had a fellowship, and I thought, well, I am just, I'm the bee's knees, right? I've got a fellowship, I'm cool, I'm one of the cool kids. And he sat us all down and he handed on an essay that he'd written titled, What a Student Owes a Teacher. And right away we all looked at him and went, what? What we owe you? And he kind of laid down the law. I will do my part, but this is your part in this classroom. And I'll tell you, I don't know if people have these kinds of experiences, but I learned my lesson with Father Shaw, where I walked up to him at the Christmas party my first year there, and I thought I'd been doing okay in his class. And I said, hey, what do you say, Father? Peace on earth, goodwill towards men? And he looked over his glasses and he said, what I say to you, Mr. Nichols, is repent. It was the best thing for me because it was great advice.
Let me take one question down here, and then we're going to have to wrap things up. Just on the rim. Just keep your finger down on the rim.
Okay.
There you go.
You said that Russia was undermining our democracy. Isn't that what you said? Okay.
Attacking our democracy, yes.
How so? Explain that to me.
They are trying to raise questions about the integrity of our elections. They broke into whether you're a Democrat or a Republican, breaking into the email of an official of one of our major parties, those are our political institutions. I have never been a registered Democrat. I mean, it's not my tribe. But I will defend to the death the right of the Democratic National Committee to have its own internal communications without the Russians stealing them. And it particularly struck me that they then went through WikiLeaks, curated the release, put it out to Americans, and kept pushing the message that your system is corrupt. And what they really mean is, your system is as corrupt as ours. You're no better than we are. Vladimir Putin is not a dictator. Your system stinks too, which we know is wrong. And I went all over Central Europe in the fall, talking about Russian disinformation in the Czech Republic and Slovakia. And they said, well, but aren't you concerned they've taken it? I said, look, then the Europeans were you could see them kind of smiling about how wonderful. I said, in the United States, elections are controlled locally. If you're going to accuse people of falsifying elections, you have to turn to your neighbor and say, you have falsified my vote. And you, and you. I said, and Americans are hesitant to do that. And what the Russians have gotten us to do is to think that way and to look at each other with distrust and to think that our own elections do not have any integrity, because I don't think they were out to elect Donald Trump. And in fact, there was a very interesting interview with David Remnick last night, a Russian. Yes,
yeah, saw it.
That piece, I highly recommend it. And Remnick was on television last night. He said, they may be having buyer's regret about Trump right now because he's so unstable and unpredictable. But that was a side effect. What they really wanted to do was just dump a barrel of hot garbage all over the American electoral system so that they could stop feeling so inferior about their own decrepit electoral system. And they've succeeded. Look, I'm not too big a person to admit that when we've been outplayed by our opponent, that you got to give them the win. And they have outplayed us on this one. And I think we have to respond and kind of recover our sense of trust among ourselves as citizens first and foremost. Maybe that's, when you ask me, how does all this end, the more optimistic advice that I will give you is, just be nice to each other. Stop being so mean to each other. Stop going on, stop reading Facebook memes and circulating them to your friends as a kind of sticking the knife in and twisting it to see if you can annoy the other people in your Facebook group. Stop going on Twitter to see if you can just kind of kick the dog at the end of the day. We are all fellow citizens in the greatest country in the world, and we need to start treating each other like that. And I think that could get us past this, if only we just commit to doing it and to start just being nicer to each other.
I'm going to... I'm going to have to wrap things up there. We could go another hour with Professor Nichols easily. But two things before we go. Our next event is on the 8th. It's a week from Wednesday, I believe. It is the superintendent of the Milwaukee Public Schools, Dr. Darian Driver. She will be here. That is sold out. I mention that only because, and I hope some people are doing that today, we're streaming these events live, so if you cannot be in a full room like the one today, you haven't registered in advance, you can watch it on our website, law.marquette.edu. The only other thing I want to mention before we wrap up is, again, the name of the book is The Death of Expertise, The Campaign Against Established Knowledge and Why It Matters. There are books being sold out here in our lobby area. If you're interested, you can pick one up there. Again, thanks so much for your interest, your time, your attention, and most of all, thanks to Professor Tom Nichols.
Thank you.
Great job, Tom.